Welcome to the People's Health Briefing, a component of the Trusted Voices campaign. I'm Dr. Noha Abalada from Roots Community Health Center, reporting for the week of October 16th, 2023. After a COVID status update, I'll discuss some information regarding the Novavax vaccine. As health professionals rooted in Oakland, serving some of the people most vulnerable to getting and suffering from COVID-19, we're here to cut through the noise to give you information you can use to make choices that will keep you, your loved ones, and your community as safe as possible. COVID is still with us. It is still causing sickness, disability, and death, and there's still a lot we don't know. The goal of the People's Health Briefing is to empower you with our best knowledge and thinking every Tuesday morning. First, for a COVID status update, starting out with wastewater. This graph is showing the percentage of sites across the country that have increasing or decreasing levels of SARS-CoV-2. And if we look over to the far right, just before that shaded gray area, in general, we can see that things are kind of going down, but they are kind of zigzagging a little bit. I think we need a little more time to be certain about the direction, but I think what is ending up to be most important here is first a couple things. That black line is showing the number of sites reporting, and when it was high up at the top up there, it was in the 1300s. So I'm hoping that it's just taking time for sites to upload their information and that it's not actually dropping off, because if the number of sites drops off, this is going to become less reliable as an indicator across the country. But I think the other thing that we know is important, we've talked about every week here, is that if you want to get a sense of what's going on in your area, you need to take a look at wastewater sites that are near you. So I've put some of those resources in the post, and it is helpful if you're trying to get some early indicators on what is going on around you. So not totally conclusive here, but in general, looks like it's trying to come down. And here we can see that percent positivity is coming down, which is a good thing. It's been coming down since our most recent peak, which was in late August. And we're now at 10.9% positivity. This is based upon about 70,000 tests per week. So this percent positivity is still more than double where we were in June, but it's good that we're heading in the right direction, and we'll continue to keep an eye on that. And next is emergency department visits. And this is our most updated indicator. This continues to be our most updated indicator. We have data here that's going through October 13th. So that's great. It's really pretty updated. And luckily, we can see that this is continuing to come down as well. So the latest peak was in late August as well. So it kind of coincides there with the percent positivity. So good to see it coming down basically for all of the month of September and all of October so far. And so when we see this coming down, we hope that that's going to be followed by hospitalization and death. So we'll take a look at that next. We can start to see that we're having some decreases in hospitalizations as well. This has basically been ticking down for 4 weeks in a row now. So we're now at 16,766. So I think we can say that we're slowly but steadily coming down for about the past month, but we are still over 16,000 new weekly hospital admissions. So that's more than double what we were seeing for most of the month of June. So still quite a lot of people being admitted every week with or for COVID, but once again, good to see it going in the right direction. And also, I think helpful that we are noting that there is a pattern in terms of each indicator following the next. And the last but not least, obviously, our latest indicator here would be COVID deaths, one of our most reliable indicators. This is a definitive indicator when we see COVID as a cause of death or a contributing cause of death. And the week ending September 16th, there were 1,274 deaths. That was up from the week before. So September 16th, that's already a month old, but it is the last week where we have confirmed numbers, and those numbers do lag behind a little bit. But unfortunately, deaths have gone up consistently since mid-July. So again, consistent with what we've been seeing for a while now, which is that the hospital deaths, or the deaths lag behind the hospital by about a month or so. So if that pattern holds, then we should expect to see deaths to start coming down in the coming weeks. That remains to be seen, but we will keep an eye on that. So I will just sort of say again that I cannot get comfortable with the fact that just this past July, we got down as low as 473 deaths in a week, but we could not maintain that. We couldn't or keep going down. And that's what we would really hope to see at this point, where we're feeling like we're at a new point and we feel like we're doing better and we feel like we have tools. Well, if that's the case, we shouldn't see deaths going back up in this fashion. So from 473 to now 1274, so what, 2.5 times the number of deaths that we had just a couple of months ago. So for me, that's a really sobering reality that kind of makes it hard to say that we're winning here. We really can't say we've got things figured out. We've got certain things that are improved, but this is, over 1,200 deaths per week is still quite significant, several thousand every month. And the most important thing we can do now to prevent these deaths in particular is to ensure that those who do turn positive, who are at risk, get treated in a timely fashion. The sooner the better as it relates to those antivirals. And obviously we want to stop spreading it around at this rate. And we want to make sure that people are up to date on vaccines. We want to do what we can to improve indoor air quality and all of those things. But I think knowing that there's such a high number of cases still and such a lot of transmission, we really need to be very alert that as soon as someone gets symptoms, if there's someone who should be treated, that needs to happen right away so that we can hopefully start to see improvements in this number of deaths. And now for the no news is good news segment, there's nothing significant really to say here. These are all Omicron subvariants in the XBB family. So these are the forecasted US variant proportions, and this is a good thing. These are the variants that the new boosters are tuned against. So hopefully this slide will stay nice and boring from now on, but obviously no guarantees with all the transmission we have, but we'll just continue to keep an eye on this. So you may have heard the news that on October 3rd, the FDA approved or really amended the approval of the Novavax vaccine for their new updated variety. So this is a third option now for us here in the United States. We have the two mRNA options, Pfizer and Moderna. And we have, of course, the new monovalent formulations of those two, the Pfizer and the Moderna. Those have been out for a few weeks now. And now we also have the new Novavax formulation as well. So this is approved for anyone 12 and up. And if you previously had a COVID-19 vaccine, you are still eligible to receive 1 dose of the Novavax. That is, if you haven't gotten a vaccine in the last 2 months, and if you didn't already get the Pfizer or Moderna monovalent vaccine. So if it's been more than 2 months since your COVID vaccine, you are eligible for the new Novavax formulation. And if you're completely unvaccinated, you actually are eligible to receive 2 doses. And even though the approval says the 2 doses could be 3 weeks apart, most of the recommendations are really saying that unless there's some reason you need to rush, that waiting 8 weeks is probably the way to go. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But if you haven't had a COVID vaccine for more than 2 months, you haven't had a COVID infection for more than 3 months, then now is the time to be thinking about getting your booster. And now Novavax is an option for you. So you can get it, but should you? So that's what I'm going to try to get into today. But I think it's fair to say and to start by saying that unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot in the way of definitive answers. And in fact, I'm not going to be telling you anything too earth-shattering today. I don't think we're going to have too many super compelling reasons to go one way or another, but there are some reasons and some things that might help inform a decision that we will walk through today, and hopefully we'll shed some light on some. So first off, why do we not have this definitive information? So I think there's a couple of reasons. First is that from the beginning, there were just so many hurdles and delays with Novavax. So by the time it came out, most people who wanted to get a vaccine had already gone ahead and got an mRNA vaccine. And then by the time the Novavax came out, not only did a lot of people already get the mRNA vaccine, but then so many people also got infected. So you had people who were vaccinated and infected, people who were unvaccinated and infected, and all of these combinations of things by the time that Novavax came out. And so that made it basically almost impossible to do real head-to-head studies because there were just too many variables at play at that point. And of course, those continued to evolve as more people got infected and vaccinated and so on. So if we had been able to do some of these studies very early on, then I think we would have much better comparative data. But by the time Novavax hit the scene, the waters were kind of already muddied, so to speak, making it really difficult to do any direct comparisons. The second issue is related, and it's about having low uptake. So again, by the time Novavax came out, most of the people who wanted to get vaccinated already had. So the uptake of Novavax was low. And I have to also say, I was more than a little disappointed that there was not really any kind of campaign, any enthusiasm or robust campaign for Novavax by the government at all. We didn't see that here in California. We didn't see it nationwide. And that was really kind of frustrating. And it was frustrating because even though, yes, a lot of people had already gotten vaccinated, when Novavax came out, we still had high numbers of people who had not yet received any vaccine. And a lot of people had expressed that they hadn't gotten the vaccine because they weren't comfortable with the mRNA for whatever reason. Either it was newer or whatever reason, they weren't comfortable with the mRNA. So this was an alternative. And we saw that when the J&J first came out, there was a lot of enthusiasm around it because it used old technology. So we thought, same premise, that when Novavax came out, that there would be some enthusiasm around it. There would be a big push. There would be some advertising. But none of that came to pass. And I think it's really unfortunate because still to this day, I am still coming across people who have never heard of Novavax. And that is unfortunate because it has been a viable alternative for a while now, and it continues to be. So if we take a look at the number of vaccines that have been administered in the United States, you can see that we've had over 400 million Pfizer. If you look at the original and the booster, over 400 million Pfizer, over 250 million Moderna administered. These data are through May 10th, so they're actually even a little bit old. But as of May 10th, we only had administered 89,000 Novavax. So that's a pretty small number. And so again, this makes it difficult for us to draw conclusions, let alone being able to provide any kind of head-to-head comparisons. But nonetheless, I think there's a lot of suggestive information and a lot of just basic information that we can use to consider. So what is Novavax? Novavax is the only protein-based COVID-19 vaccine in the United States. And I'm sharing a slide from Novavax here that is showing the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus there on the left. And on the right is kind of this piece of the vaccine spike protein. So it's a small particle. It's basically harmless copies of the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, which, as we know, is the protein that the virus uses to enter the cell. And this vaccine also contains an adjuvant, which is basically just a substance that helps to boost your immune response. And this is, of course, different from the mRNA vaccines. The mRNA vaccines deliver a message to the cells that tells the cells how to make the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, and then our cells make copies of the protein. And then our immune system can recognize those as being foreign and then produce antibodies against that. So it's kind of a difference between delivering the full protein to you versus delivering the recipe for the protein to you. And so that, in its simplest sense, is the biggest difference between the protein subunit and the mRNA. And then, of course, the adjuvant, which is called matrix M. And so I'm showing you here a slide from Novavax from the ACIP meeting. that was held in September, where they went over all the data for the 3 vaccines. And here it's just showing the adjuvant there, which kind of looks like a see-through soccer ball or something. And basically, this is it's a proprietary compound by Novavax, and they developed it from the bark of a Chilean soap bark tree. And this matrix M basically further stimulates the immune system. And it's actually being used now in other vaccines, including a recently approved malaria vaccine. And there's even some suggestions that we should be adding an adjuvant to the mRNA vaccine. There is actually a mouse study out there that has some compelling evidence that if we were to adjuvant the mRNA vaccines, that we would get a better response. I'm not going to go over that one in a lot of detail, but I did link it in the post. I'm just not going to go over a lot of detail because it was mice. Again, we don't have the type of robust human data that we need to draw, conclusions. But I think it's fair to say that an adjuvant may help the mRNA vaccines to be more effective. And they certainly do help boost the immune response as it relates to the Novavax vaccine, as well as a number of other vaccines that use adjuvants. So this is, a different approach to giving us immunity. And so just to review, a protein subunit vaccine contains some harmless pieces of the virus plus the adjuvant that helps the immune system protect you against COVID. This vaccine type has been used for decades. It's the same technology as older vaccines like hepatitis B and shingles. And then, of course, just like any of the COVID vaccines, it's going to give you that protection without obviously the risk of catching COVID and having serious consequences. So I think to sort of sum this part up, both Novavax and mRNA vaccines are safe and they are effective. They've been tested in millions of people. They've been shown to be very good at preventing serious illness, hospitalization, and death. And I think, again, the protection, we can compare from the very original trial data, but I didn't want to bring that trial data back up now because we're so many variants in at this point that I don't think is very relevant to try to compare the protection that we got from those original vaccines against the original viruses because we're in a different place now. But really, when you take a look at the trial data, when you take a look at any of the subsequent studies, a lot of them are kind of small, but really we're just not seeing any big significant differences between the protection you're getting from serious illness, hospitalization, and death. And remember, those were really the main kind of endpoints that we were looking at in the trials. Now, since then, there have been some studies to look at how well is it protecting against infection, how well is it protecting against symptoms. There's a study out of Italy that is showing this for Novavax, and it looks really quite similar again to mRNA. Not great, right? We know that protection against infection and against symptoms are, in the 50% and below area. And that's true for all the vaccines essentially. And this is actually for prior vaccines. I'm not even talking about the ones that just came out because we really don't have enough experience with those to be giving this kind of data yet either. So we're waiting for that still. So as you can see, I think we feel, fairly confident that protection against symptoms and transmission is not amazing, but it's decent for all of them and not a whole lot different. And protection against severe outcomes is pretty amazing. And it seems pretty equivalent. Now, how long does it last? This is another thing that we're not quite sure. There have been some small studies that have suggested that perhaps with the Novavax, we're getting a little bit of a kind of broader response and a little bit of a broader cellular response. So remember, the cellular response is kind of that second line of defense. So not just the antibodies, but that second line of defense. Not super definitive, but once again, when you look at the effects of having that adjuvant there to kind of boost things, there's some evidence and some thinking that there's a more maybe diverse response that you might get from the Novavax compared to the mRNA. This is still a little bit speculative because we don't have head-to-head, but there's one more piece of important information here that I'm going to get to in a moment about this more diverse response and a way we might think about approaching this. But first, real quick on the side effects. So for the most part, the side effects seem generally similar. They're basically the swelling at the injection site, maybe a little bit less with Novavax than with the mRNA, same with sort of the headache and fatigue and muscle pain. But then you hear anecdotes of people who got a lot of side effects after Novavax and didn't have so much with the mRNAs. So each person is going to be different in this regard. So everything that I'm saying is sort of within the studies. And so we're talking about, with hundreds of people, and it's very hard to say if someone's fever was worse than the other person's fever or fatigue was worse than the other person's fatigue. But just in terms of the number of folks that get it and the types of side effects, it is roughly the same. One of the more concerning side effects, potential adverse effects with the mRNA vaccine, is the risk of myocarditis or pericarditis or myopericarditis. So the inflammation of the heart muscle or around the heart. And we know that this is more common in young men after the second dose of the vaccine. We know that the risk of myocarditis is much lower from the vaccine than it is with actually getting COVID. So the benefits still do outweigh the risk. All of the episodes of myocarditis have been non-fatal and folks have recovered. With the Novavax, there's some suggestion that it may be less, but since we don't have the numbers, it's very hard to say if it's less or the same. The country of Australia had some data that suggested that it was about the same after Novavax with their Novavax campaign. About the same incidence as with the mRNAs. But then we've had some other conflicting studies. I've linked one of those in the post. I'm also not going over that in detail, but again, just for folks who really want to dig into this information, I'm trying to present what it is that we do have or that we do know. But really, I think that the risk of myocarditis after the vaccines has been really significantly reduced by not doing those spacing out of a few weeks. Remember, in the beginning, we were doing them just a few weeks apart, and that's really when we saw the higher incidence of myocarditis. So if you're going to have to get 2 doses, which most people are not going to have to get two doses at this point, but if you're fully unvaccinated and you're going to get the 2 doses, again, spacing it 8 weeks apart is probably the recommendation, unless you're really, for some reason, in some big rush to get so-called fully vaccinated. So I don't think there's a lot of people left who are going to be getting the 2 doses. But with young people who are going to be getting it for the first time, the longer spacing is going to most likely be the thing that's recommended. This is something you should talk with your pediatrician in this case, or physician, because really we're talking about young men, and this goes probably up through 35 to 40, just to think about that spacing. And there may be a slightly lower risk with Novavax. I think that still remains to be seen. I don't think we can just say like Novavax is the solution, because we don't really have enough data to say that yet. But that is certainly something that we will keep an eye on. And I still repeat that a couple of weeks after getting the vaccine, I would take it easy. I would not do any major exertion or anything like that, just to give yourself, the time to kind of rest. So if you have let's say your son is playing high school football, something like that, I might go ahead and have them rest for a couple of weeks after the vaccine. And as I've talked about many times here, after COVID, it's even more important that they rest, and not only rest, but get cleared by their physician to return to sports. And I've spoken about that in a prior briefing as well. So it's really more concerning after getting COVID than getting the vaccine. And we don't really have definitive information that is conclusive to say that Novavax is going to be causing it any less than the mRNA vaccines, but certainly reducing the risk of catching COVID by getting vaccinated is going to still be the strategy, even for wanting to avoid myocarditis, because the most time that we've seen myocarditis, and myocarditis is not new. We had myocarditis way before the COVID vaccine, and most of the time it's actually from a virus. So post-viral, same with pericarditis. So we want to avoid those infections. And so again, vaccine is still going to be the best strategy. So kind of where we are so far, Novavax is a perfectly reasonable option, particularly if for any reason you don't want to get the mRNA. If you had a bad reaction to the mRNA, you want to go for something different. If for any reason you're just concerned about, you just didn't like it, that it was new, then, these are all good reasons to go ahead and think about doing the Novavax. And so, but what about the mixing and matching? So there was a recent study that is indicating that there might be some benefit to doing mRNA and then protein subunit, or even vice versa. So actually the study had looked at both. And it's a smaller study, and it's not completely definitive, but I do think that it shows that there may be some advantage of what we would say heterologous boosting, or basically using a different platform, a different type of vaccine, that might give a better response than just going with the same one every time. So that is also linked in the post if that is something that you might be interested in. And so I think it is potentially of interest that we think about this sort of mix and match strategy. And some of it is theoretical, because some of it says, well, if the Novavax kind of is working in a little bit different way, and it has that adjuvant, which is giving a different type of immune response, then maybe there's going to be a more diverse response, or maybe it will kind of trigger a different part of the immune response, so it will be more effective than just going with the same one every time. Others say, well, they're both based on the same spike. And so a spike is a spike, and making an antibody to a spike is making an antibody to a spike. But again, I think that there is some suggestion that because of the adjuvant, and because the spike is presented in a different way, maybe you're going to get a more diverse response, a broader response. And I think we need more kind of hard facts and data to really substantiate that. But because we're not seeing a downside, this does not seem like a bad strategy or potential option to consider. And they're both safe, they're both effective. Novavax may be slightly less reactogenic, so meaning less side effects. But again, that's not usually going to be our big consideration with the vaccine, unless you were kind of one of those people that really was just laid out for days and wants to try something different, in which case I say, I don't think it's a bad strategy at all. So get the one you're comfortable with, get the one you can get, because access has been challenging kind of across the board at this point, but certainly trying to find Novavax that hasn't been out for as long. Not everyone is going to decide to carry every vaccine. This is kind of a new day with the commercialization of the pandemic response. So we're all trying to figure it out. But I would say that it is not, there's no wrong answer here. Last thing I'll just say, one advantage that keeps being touted of the mRNA vaccines is how quickly they're able to update the formulations, because they're kind of using that same template every time. And we know that with protein vaccines, they kind of have to reformulate each time. So it does take longer for them to develop updates. But I think the reality that we're seeing, at least this time, is that Novavax was really only a few weeks behind the mRNA vaccines. So I think in terms of thinking about our strategy overall, we need better vaccines. We need a variety of vaccines. We need choices. We need some nasal vaccines. We need some vaccines that are going to stop transmission. We need more data. And one of the things I think we really need is more information on what I will call subpopulation. So people where we want to see maybe one vaccine is going to be better for certain folks with certain conditions, or who had certain reactions, or who have long COVID, because we don't have any Novavax studies just yet on folks with long COVID. And there's mixed results, as I've gone over a few times here with the mRNA vaccines. So I feel like I'm communicating that there's a lot we still don't know about the nuances between all of these, but I also think the good news is that we have more choices now. They're all good choices. They're all going to do the most important thing, which is to reduce the risk of a severe outcome. And if you're due for a booster, then I would say there's no wrong answer here. Obviously, if you have an allergy to one thing or another, that's going to make the decision for you. But for the most part, there may be some suggestion that mixing it up might be beneficial. But then, there's folks in the school of thought of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Just stick with what you got, because you don't necessarily, you know how you do with the other ones, and this is going to be a new experience. And again, I don't think there's any a right or wrong answer to this. I just think staying up to date is going to be your best bet. But it's also not the only thing, right? So we're going to continue to implement all of our best practices for stopping the spread of COVID-19. We are going to wear a high quality filtration mask when we're indoors with others. We're going to improve indoor ventilation, and we are going to try to gather outside when we can. Gathering outside is almost always safer than gathering inside. Limit our time in mixing indoors, certainly, and stay up to date on our boosters. No one layer is foolproof. We want to implement all the layers of protection. And we want to avoid repeat infection. If you've had it once, it's better not to get it a second time. If you had it twice, avoid it a third time, and so on. There is mounting evidence of the cumulative effects of repeat COVID infection. So we're wanting to avoid those post-COVID impacts, like new onset diabetes and blood clots and so on. And we want to remember that as soon as you get symptoms, it really is important to figure out what you've got, not only because we want you to have the knowledge and have the information so that you know how to best prepare, but so you can also get treated if you're eligible, also so that you can avoid spreading it to other people. One person with COVID is going to spread it to a lot more people than one person with a cold or a flu. So please keep that in mind. These are not equivalent things. And then, of course, we want to also test in order to exit isolation if we were positive, because enough virus to detect is most likely enough virus to infect. And if you don't feel well, please do stay home and rest, and don't spread what you've got to others, but also because we have seen that there's a correlation between not resting and then later having long COVID. So we don't know why that is, but we have seen that correlation. So please take the time to rest. And I wish everybody had all the sick time in the world that they needed to do that. I know that that's not always a reality, but this is something that I think we need to keep on advocating for, because it is important not only for yourself, but also for those around you. And once again, if you're someone who should be treated, if you catch COVID, you should know that in advance. Have a testing plan and a treatment plan and a caregiving plan. So for anyone you take care of, and maybe for who's going to be taking care of you. So, because we really do, of course, want to avoid household spread as much as possible. So we need a plan for isolating and for ensuring that children and anyone else who needs caregiving, that we have those arrangements made in advance. And if you don't have a primary care provider, please get one. Know how to reach them before you need them. And let's remember to eat a balanced diet. Let's incorporate fresh fruits and vegetables and avoid those sugary drinks. Consider a multivitamin supplement with some extra vitamin D. Get some regular physical activity. Unless you're sick, please get your rest. And let's get those baseline labs checked with your physician. Get your blood pressure checked. and manage your stress levels and get a good night's sleep. This concludes today's People's Health Briefing. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again next Tuesday at 10 a.m.